Hi, it's Mrs. Cheney. I want to talk to you about Roman architecture. Before we get started with the architecture, we do have to talk a little bit about the emperors and who built each of these places, and a little bit about aspects of architecture so that it all makes sense. And then I especially want to talk about the Colosseum and then maybe the Pantheon if we have time. So let's get started. This is a slide that I made up of some of the Roman emperors. Emperors reigned in what they called a dynasty, and a dynasty was all dependent, their reign all depended on how long they lived and whether or not their son took over. So here I am, Mrs. Cheney. So Mr. Cheney would be the emperor, and Mr. Cheney has sons. So I have my eldest son, Ty, after my husband died, would become the next emperor. And then if he had a son, that son would become the emperor, and so on, to keep the family name. And it would be considered the Cheney dynasty. Interesting, huh? Well, if the son of the son of the son had a girl, the family would die off, the family name would die off, and the dynasty would end. This kind of took place during the Egyptian times. They were the first ones to start this kind of thing, the dynasties and the pharaohs within each kingdom and all that kind of stuff. But the Roman emperors kind of did the same thing. Here are a few of them in particular that I want to talk about. Augustus Octavius was founder of the Roman Empire. He's pretty important because he was the son of Julius Caesar. And then you've got Titus. Titus built the Colosseum. He reigned during two disasters that were taking place. There was a great volcano and a fire in Rome. And so he decided that maybe building the Colosseum would entertain people during this bad time. Kind of like this is being filmed during what we call the COVID pandemic. And there's a lot of horrible things going on in the world. So everybody's looking for something good to entertain them, something happy. And so Titus believed that if he built the Colosseum, it would make people it would distract them from the bad things that were happening with the volcano and the fire. Hadrian built the Pantheon, and then Constantine the Great, he restructured the government. He built up a military. He included a new gold coin to help with inflation. He was a really cool emperor. And then you've got Constantine II. He became commander of Gaul at age 10 and had a military career while his father reigned. So there were some cool emperors here during this time. Before we get to talking about architecture in particular, I want you to realize and understand that the Romans invented concrete. Okay, so yes, they used stone, marble, and such to build their buildings and their temples and all that kind of stuff, but they also used concrete. They figured out how to make that. So they were the great inventors of concrete. Here's some vocabulary I would like you to know. You probably already know what the post and lintel system is. The idea behind there's two posts and then a lintel. So that was one way that they would build. They also built arches. This eliminated the need for columns to support heavy roofs. And the arches could be pointed or rounded. Okay. They had barrel vaults, and it was some sort of a tunnel. So in other words, it was an arch and an arch and an arch and an arch to make up these great tunnels. And then you had groin vaults where tunnels would cross. That happened. You had oculus. An oculus was oftentimes put at the top of a giant dome, kind of like a skylight, kind of a cool thing that they used. They invented velariums, which were awnings. The Colosseum had the biggest one, and it was built to protect the spectators. We have giant stadiums today, and some of them have awnings. Some of them have sides that come up really high. Some of them have domes. So we still use those same concepts today in our stadiums. Sorry, going the wrong way. They had a forum in Greece and Rome, It was a gathering place for judicial business, kind of like the town square. So that's a term you should know. Aqueducts carried water to the city. Public baths were used with varying water temperatures for people to go and bathe. Okay, and the water was warmed with a pipe system. Now, I want to talk about the Colosseum. Okay. We talked about how the emperor wanted to build a place to distract people from what was going on in the world. So he built this Colosseum, and this is what it looks like today in ruin. It had shows that would take place there, and most of the shows lasted all day. 2 Greek theaters were put face together, more or less, to create the oval-shaped stadium. The inner circle ring was made of concrete, and this required less skill and time and money than to transport rock. Okay, so they figured out a way to use that concrete. They called it at one time the Flavian in its day. It was called the Flavian, not the Colosseum. And an Emperor Vespasian, if I'm saying that right, the first emperor of a dynasty, Emperor Titus completed it 10 years later. So the first emperor that started it was Vespasian, and then Titus completed it. The Colosseum was given to a nickname to it later on during the Middle Ages. Okay. A couple of other things about it. It was 187 feet high. It's equivalent to like a 12-story building. Here's some more pictures. It has extensive uses of vaults and Roman arches. It could hold 50,000 people. Spectators sat based on gender and social class. The lower class and the women sat at the top. And then as you were richer, you got better seats. Just like today, when you go to a football game or a basketball game at a stadium, your seats are based on how much money you had. But the women were forced to climb to the top, as well as the poor people. There was statuary at one time in the arches on 2 of the levels, on levels 2 and 3, but not level 1, because those arches were used as doorways. Level 4 was at the very top, had more of a solid wall, where there were arches on the other ones that were purely decorative. That awning that I talked about earlier was stretched around the top of it, and it was called a velarium, and it protected the spectators from sun and rain and things like that. Here's a sketch where you can kind of see poles that were attached, and then the awning stretched across it, so that these spectators, again, would have some protection. Now, I find this to be interesting that the richer people down at the bottom didn't get as much protection as the women and the poor folk at the top. Okay. 3 different types of columns were used to support the arches. Level 1 had Doric columns, level 2 had the Ionic columns, and level 3 had the Corinthian columns. The columns were sturdier at the bottom and fancier as you went up. These columns were also associated with femininity at the top because women sat up there. They thought there was something prettier to look at. And I agree, they're the prettiest column as well. The Colosseum had a flat stage that stretched across it, all made of wood. Okay. Underneath were all these tunnels and cages for lions and tigers and things like that, and prisoners that they would put under there, or they had little dressing stations and things like that for the people that were performing. So they had all kinds of rooms down below and hallways down below. And that floor, of course, had sand on it that it would absorb the blood. Now, when we talk about entertainment, we talk about watching murder, where people would be thrown out onto the floor and they had to fight to the death. Other people, or lions and animals, were released, and the people had to fight for entertainment to entertain everybody else. Kind of sad. At one time, the wooden floor was filled with water. And that went on for quite some time, and they had mock sea battles. This stopped because, of course, the wood floor started getting damaged. Gladiator fights ended in 404 AD because Christians thought it was immoral. Most damage was due to earthquakes. Earthquakes took place several times and damaged the place as well. Some of the stones are used or were used later on to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I think that's kind of cool that they hauled them over to build St. Peter's. Okay. Now I want to talk about the Pantheon. There's a Parthenon and a Pantheon. The reason we can remember the Pantheon is that the top of it has a dome. Here's a slide with one of each. Let me move myself. Where the Parthenon had the pointed roof and all the columns, the Roman Pantheon in Rome had a pointed roof and columns, but it also has a dome at the top. And I think of it like a pan. You've got your frying pan, and it flips upside down to cover it like a dome. I think that's kind of neat. Hence the word Pantheon. The Emperor Hadrian had it built. Okay. It was built to honor all the Roman gods, not just one god in particular. An oculus or a skylight was put at the top, and it was his only source of light. It's still there today. You can still walk in it today. And yes, it rains inside. Okay. It is 144 feet wide and 144 feet tall. It is a square or cylinder, I guess I should say. The dome gets thinner towards the top as it goes up, and pumice stone was used, added to the concrete to make it lighter, because they found that if they added concrete up at the top, that concrete would get heavy and push down. So they added pumice to it. They also carved into that dome to make it a little bit thinner. All those little rings were not just decorative, but it was removed to remove some of the concrete, so the weight could be lessened. When the Romans converted to Catholicism, the building was made into a Catholic church, and it still is today, and little restoration has ever been needed. I think that's very cool in comparison to other cathedrals and churches and things that we have studied that have fallen apart.